things individually. You have to take them in the whole. That, like, if my two grandsons, I'm a firm believer in corporal punishment, so I give my two grandsons a clip around the ear on a regular basis, because instead of studying Caesar's Gallic Wars, they're shooting Germans on the television in company with tender pals, and I've killed 100 and you've killed 200 or whatever. So, like, how can you, to that generation whose life is not reality? Like, I'm sure there must be kids who have television girlfriends, if you know what I mean, unreal ones, you know. Like, I'm sure. Now, what child develops, and we know this is true, that the development of children is hindered by the fact my 2-year-old grandson can swipe. He knows swipe, you know. If I go out to dinner again, I clip them around the ear if they dare take a phone now when I take them out to dinner. But if I look at the other tables, all the kids are on phones and iPads and are talking to their parents. So what kind of a generation, therefore, are you going to have whose life is unreal as opposed to real? I don't know, but it's scary. But if you then, so therefore, you're now Joseph Goebbels 2050, right? And you're in Ireland, and you got all these kids who are swiping and watching and clicking, and somehow you can get to them. God above. Think of the power. Imagine if Goebbels had the internet, you know. So, like, there's a wonderful book by a fellow called Ian Kershaw, which I'm reading at the moment. It's about the end. It's the last 12 months of the war, and the question kept being asked, like, why did the Germans keep fighting? Like, they were losing hand over fist. They lost more people, not just soldiers, people in the last 12 months of the war than in the previous 5. So, like, why? And it's all about Goebbels' propaganda. Hitler was in the bunker, you know, out of his mind. Goebbels was keeping the whole thing going on propaganda. So if you, I think, as I did for a long time, this will never happen again, you know. Now it's out there. It's staring us in the face. And I'm okay, you can call me a scaredy cat, you can call me, you know, you can call me any name you like. You know, sticks and stones will break my bones, hard words never hurt me. I don't give a hoot. But I'm scared. I won't be around to see it, but I'm scared. They can control now. This isn't Orwellian 1984. The facility exists, as Zuckerberg proved last week. They can control it. I think I'm done. You've got another speech.
Michael Leahy here is going to introduce our next speaker, and then after that I have some forms with me for those of you who are not already registered members of the party, so if you want to approach me afterwards. So, Michael Leahy.
I'll just speak for a few minutes about the background of our party, and then I'll have a very pleasurable task of introducing Professor Dolores Cattle to you, who some of you have come to know very well over the last couple of months. I suppose there's an increasing awareness among many people in our country that Ireland is at present approaching something of an end game. Certainly many of the people in this room, I think, would feel that. Many of the issues that have interested us and fascinated us, the things that we regard as ridiculous, like political correctness, we could laugh it off some years ago. But I think we're now coming to realise that it's no longer laughable. It is very, very sinister and very, very destructive, and I think George Hook gave a very good illustration of that in his speech. When I speak of endgame, I don't speak just in terms of our preserving our national independence and preserving our democratic institutions. I speak also of the increasing attacks against our civil institutions, and perhaps more important, against our historic freedoms, our political and religious liberties, which are the essence of our society. but which are today manifested under the types of attack that would have been unthinkable only a decade ago. 100 years ago, our state was established, ostensibly to achieve parliamentary independence. But the Irish independence movement was effectively the culmination of a centuries-old struggle, which had at its core the establishment of civil liberties, the demand for freedom of speech, and most importantly at that time, the establishment of freedom of religious worship. It cannot now be denied 100 years later that these freedoms, and most particularly freedom of speech, is under sustained and relentless attack within our society. I could give many examples from our universities, from our political establishment, from the corporate world of employment, but there are two that you might be familiar with. Many of you will be aware of the efforts made by Gemma O'Doherty over the past few weeks to establish a movement for a reform of our political system. And you will also be aware of the efforts that have been made through mob action and mob violence to close down her speeches and to prevent her meetings from taking place. You will also be aware of the fact that during the last two referenda, particularly the referendum in regard to marriage, or more correctly the abolition of marriage, that it became impossible for people to speak openly in support of the status quo without being intimidated, publicly bullied, and in some cases physically assaulted. No democracy, indeed no stable society, can long prevail where there is acceptance of that level of attack against the most basic political and civic freedoms that we have for so long taken for granted. That is why in coming to name this new party, we decided to change the name from our exit to the Irish Freedom Party. The principal aims of that party are not just about re-establishing legislative independence for this country, important though that is, but also re-establishing the basic rights of free expression, freedom of association, freedom of thought, against an extreme model of political correctness, which has now become mainstream in our media and in our politics. As Orwell taught to us, that idea which cannot be spoken very quickly becomes that idea which can no longer be thought. So what we are defending is not just freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And if we as human beings don't have that freedom, we cease to be fully functioning human beings. I would very much like to pay tribute to George Hook and to thank him for his wonderful speech here today. He is somebody who has undergone the experience of having gone against the accepted public narrative, albeit in a very small way and in a very sensible way, typically for George. But he knows what it is to receive the bullying and the intimidation to which every person who goes outside the narrative is subjected today. And I'd like to congratulate him in not letting the bullies win out on this occasion. I certainly don't always agree with George's opinions, and he wouldn't agree with mine, but he is a man who's capable of holding opinions and of having arguments. Sadly, the fact of holding opinions which go against the accepted narrative is no longer tolerated in modern Ireland. We have come to a point where there is only one form of accepted political discourse, and there is only one form of opinion which the Irish people are allowed to have. One of the remarkable things is that it is our journalists, more so than our politicians, who have played a significant role in closing down public debate and who call for restrictions on freedom of speech. There is possibly one exception to this, and that's local journalists, local newspapers and local radio, where you have a far better opportunity of getting your message across. And for those who have asked, what can we do? I think the local radios and the local newspapers still have an element of freedom and may still be worth looking at. Nothing illustrates the severe dangers of restricting open political debate more than the following. Perhaps the greatest discussion that we should have over the next several years is that regarding the government's plan, Ireland 2040. In particular, that plan's proposal in regard to population increase, something which many have described as potential population replacement. In its broadest form, the policy is that the population of the entirety of the island should increase from circa 5.7 million at present to just under 7 million by 2040, an increase of over 1 million. Now, no reason is given as to why this is desirable, or indeed whether it should be accepted, but the plan sets out a detailed strategy of investment in infrastructure, transport facilities and housing to meet this population growth. 116 billion is the projected investment. The government accepts that this increase cannot come from the native population. They claim approximately half will come from the native population. However, given the catastrophically low birth rate of the native Irish population, it largely it must be said as a result of government policy, it is clear that the greater proportion of that population will in the first instance come from abroad, and it is equally clear that it cannot come from